The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $40, and Delbert Hoyle laughed loud enough to bounce off the tin roof of the sale barn. It was the 12th of April, 1978, at the Merriweather Estate Auction, 3 miles east of Sable Creek in the flat brown country, where the Ozarks give up and lay down into farmland. The chest sat on the sawdust floor between 2 folding chairs, and every man in that barn had walked past it twice before the bidding began. It was a steamer trunk, the old kind, humpback and banded in steel, and someone at some point had wrapped it twice around with a length of tow chain and welded a padlock hasp directly into the iron of the bands. The leather straps had rotted off years ago. The brass corners were green. The wood beneath the canvas had swelled and split in 3 places along the lid, and the whole thing smelled faintly of river mud and something older, like an attic that had once caught fire and been put out with well water. Elias Coker paid the $40 in 4 folded $10 bills, and did not look at anyone when he did it. He was 68 years old that spring, lean as a fence rail, stooped a little at the shoulders from a lifetime bent over visas and workbenches. He wore a gray work cap gone dark at the sweatband, a chambray shirt buttoned to the throat, and a canvas jacket the color of old hay. His hands, when he counted the bills onto the clerk's table, were the map of his trade. 2 knuckles on the right hand had been broken and set crooked. A pale burn scar ran from the base of his thumb up under the cup. The nails were short and clean and permanently darkened at the edges, with the fine gray dust that a locksmith carries, the way a baker carries flour. Delbert Hoyle was 49, and looked younger from a distance and older up close. He owned the Ford dealership out on Route 9 and a stake in the feed mill and half the storefronts on the north side of the square, and he wore all of it on his person. That morning it was a mustard yellow sport coat over a white golf shirt, a gold ring on the little finger, a gold watch loose enough to slide, and a pair of ostrich boots. His pickup, parked outside, was a 2-week-old F-150, the color of a fire engine, and it made Elias Coker's 1961 Chevrolet look like something dragged out of a creek. Delbert had bid a joke, bid of $35, just to run the price up, and when Elias came back with $40 and no one else moved, Delbert threw both hands in the air like a man surrendering to a comedy. $40 for a boat anchor, he said loud, to the crowd and not to Elias. Boys, Coker just bought himself the fanciest boat anchor in Chester County. What are you going to do with it, Elias? Chain it to your other one? The barn laughed, because a barn will laugh when a rich man tells it to. Elias folded the receipt into his shirt pocket and did not answer. What Delbert Hoyle did not know, and what no other man in that barn had bothered to notice, was that the padlock welded to the hasp was not a padlock at all. It was a Miller 6-Lee, and someone with a torch had cut the shackle off and welded a plain hardware store shank back on in its place, and done a bad job of it. The original body of the lock was still there, and stenciled on the underside of the chest, half rubbed off and half painted over, were 4 letters and a number that Elias had seen from 6 feet away when the barn boys tipped the chest to move it. The letters were USQM, and the number was 1918, and beneath that, in a hand that had been done with a brush and not a stencil, in paint that had once been white, was a name, Merriweather. T.J. Elias had known Tobias Merriweather. Not well, and not lately, but he had known him the way men in small counties know each other, by the sound of a voice at a filling station and the shape of a hand raised from a passing truck. Tobias Merriweather had come home from France in the winter of 1919 with a limp and a quiet way of speaking, had married a schoolteacher named Ada, had farmed the bottom ground east of Sable Creek for 41 years, and had died in 1961 under a cloud that never quite lifted. The cloud was this. In the fall of 1959, the county bank had failed, and the story that settled over Sable Creek like a low fog was that Tobias Merriweather, who had been on the bank's board of directors, had emptied a strong box of depositor gold and buried it somewhere on his bottom ground before the auditors arrived. He was never charged. There was never any proof, but there was never any proof against it either. And a rumor without proof is the heaviest kind, because there is nothing to lift. Ada Merriweather had lived on alone in a farmhouse until the previous winter, when she had died at 84 in a nursing home in Rolla, and now everything the Merriweathers had ever owned was being sold off in pieces on a Wednesday morning in April to pay the last of the medical bills. The chest had come out of a locked room at the back of the barn. The auctioneer had called it a curiosity. Delbert Hoyle had called it a boat anchor. Elias Coker had called it $40 and carried it home. He had learned his trade from a man named Alvin Petrie, who had kept a shop on Water Street in Cape Girardeau from 1922 until the flood of 1957. Alvin Petrie had told Elias, when Elias was 17 and holding his first tension wrench upside down, "At a lock is a promise a man makes to himself about what he intends to protect, and that a good locksmith is not a thief and not a magician, but a listener. You listen to the lock," Alvin had said. "You listen the way a doctor listens to a chest. It will tell you what is wrong with it if you give it the time." Elias had given locks the time for 51 years by that April morning, and there was almost nothing left in the county with a keyhole in it that he could not talk into opening. He drove the chest home slow, in the bed of the Chevrolet, wrapped in a moving blanket he kept folded behind the seat for exactly this kind of work. The road out to his place ran along the creek for 2 miles, and then climbed a low rise to a white frame house with a tin-roofed shop behind it. He backed the truck up to the shop door and slid the chest onto a wheeled dolly and rolled it inside and closed the door behind him. He did not open the chest that day. He did not touch the lock that day. He set the chest on 2 sawhorses in the middle of the shop floor and turned on the overhead bulb and walked around it 3 times, slow-looking, and then he sat down on his shop stool and looked at it for another 40 minutes without moving. That was how Alvin Petrie had taught him to start. You do not put your hands on a thing until you have put your eyes on it. By the following morning, the story of the $40 boat anchor was already running through Sable Creek, the way a grass fire runs a fence line. At the Bluebird Diner on Main Street, Delbert Hoyle held court in the back booth with 2 of his salesmen and told the story 3 times before 10 o'clock, and each time the price went down. By noon, it was $30 and a rusted footlocker. By supper, it was a joke that a stranger passing through could have repeated back verbatim after 1 cup of coffee. Somebody, probably Delbert himself, had started calling it the Coker Coffin, and the name stuck the way names do in a town where there is not much else moving. Merle Vansant came out to the shop on the 3rd day. Merle was 71 and had been a mechanic at the Sinclair station since before there was a Sinclair station, and he and Elias had been friendly for most of a lifetime in the way that men who trust each other but do not need each other. Merle stood in the shop door with his hands in his coveralls and looked at the chest on the sawhorses and rolled a toothpick from one side of his mouth to the other. "Delbert's telling it all over town," Merle said. "Says you got taken for $40 by a dead woman." Elias was sitting on his stool with a small mirror on a wand and a penlight, and he did not look up. "It'll open," he said. Merle nodded like a man who had expected exactly that answer, and stood there another minute, and then said, "You need any help hauling it?" And Elias said, "No, but I thank you," and Merle went back to town without another word, because that was how they had always talked to each other, and neither one of them saw any reason to change it now. Elias worked on the chest for 11 days. He did not work fast, and he did not work all at once. He would go out to the shop in the morning after his coffee and work for 2 hours, and then come in for dinner, and then go back out for 2 hours in the afternoon, and then quit before the light went bad. The first 3 days he did not touch the lock at all. He took photographs of the chest from every angle with a Polaroid camera. He kept for insurance work. He measured the chain and the hasp and the bands. He scraped a small patch of paint from the underside and confirmed the stencil with a magnifying lens, and he wrote what he had found in a spiral notebook in a hand that had never been taught cursive but had learned to print with the neatness of a draftsman. U.S. Quartermaster, 1918, Meriwether. T.J. Tobias had gone to France as a supply sergeant with the 35th Division. The chest had gone with him and had come back with him, and it had sat in a locked barn room for 59 years, and somebody at some point had wrapped it in chain and welded the hasp shut and painted over the stencil, and the somebody had almost certainly been Tobias himself. On the 4th day, Elias began on the weld. He did not cut it. Cutting it would have been the quick way and also the wrong way, because a torch on that chest would have gone through the wood beneath the bands and destroyed whatever was inside. He worked the weld with a small hand file, an inch at a time, resting the file every few strokes so the heat would not build. It took him 2 full days to file through a bead of steel that a man with a grinder could have taken off in 90 seconds. Elias did not own a grinder. He had never owned one. Alvin Petrie had said once that power tools were for men in a hurry and men in a hurry break. Things in Elias had believed him then and believed him still. On the 6th day, with the weld filed off, he lifted the chain away from the chest and laid it on the bench and looked at the Miller 6 lever underneath. The body of the lock was intact. The keyway was packed with 60 years of dust and 1 dead spider. He cleaned the keyway with a dental pick and a puff of air from a rubber bulb, and he sat down in front of the lock with a set of picks Alvin Petrie had given him in 1946, and he began to listen. If you have ever watched a quiet man do a thing he has done 10,000 times and felt in your chest that you were seeing something the world does not make anymore, and known without being told that this is the kind of thing worth slowing down for, then you already know what kind of story this is. And I would be grateful if you'd take a moment to subscribe, because there are more of them where this one came from, and they get told here and almost nowhere else. The Miller 6 lever took him 4 evenings. He worked it in the yellow light of the overhead bulb with the shop door open to the spring air, and on the 4th evening, at 8:15, with a whippoorwill starting up in the elm behind the shop, the last lever fell, and the bolt slid, and the lock came open in his hand with a sound like a held breath finally letting go. He did not open the chest. He set the lock on the bench beside the chain and he wiped his hands on a shop rag, and he went inside and made himself a cup of coffee, and drank it standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the dark shape of the shop, and only then, when the coffee was gone and the cup washed and set upside down in the drainer, the chest was lined in tin, and the tin had kept it dry. The first thing he saw was a folded square of oilcloth on top, and beneath the oilcloth was a canvas mail sack, army issue, with a drawstring pulled tight and knotted. Beneath the mail sack was a wooden tray, and in the tray were three things, laid out as neatly as a man lays out his tools when he knows he will not be coming back for them: a leather portfolio cracked at the spine, a cotton pouch, heavy, tied with a shoelace, and a single envelope, unsealed, with two words written across the front in a careful, old-fashioned hand: "To whoever." Elias sat down on his stool and looked at the envelope for a long time before he opened it. When he did, he opened it slowly, and he read the letter inside twice, once to himself in silence, and once out loud in a voice that was not quite steady, alone in the shop, with the whippoorwill going in the elm outside. The letter was dated the 14th of November, 1959, and it was signed Tobias J. Merriweather, in a hand that had begun to tremble, but had not yet given up. It said, in the plain, unadorned English of a man who had been taught to write letters home from a trench, that on the 9th of October, 1959, 3 weeks before the Chester County Bank had failed, Tobias had walked into the vault on a Saturday morning with the bank president, a man named Harlan Delf, and had watched Harlan Delf transfer the entire contents of the depositor's gold reserve, some $14,300 in double eagles, into 2 canvas sacks, and carry them out the back door to a waiting Buick. That Tobias had objected, and had been threatened, and had been told that if he spoke a word his son, who was then a 20-year-old airman at Whiteman Field, would be found to have stolen government property. That Tobias had gone home, and had not slept for 4 nights. That on the 5th night he had driven to Harlan Delf's house and had recovered one of the 2 sacks from the trunk of the Buick, which Harlan Delf had left unlocked because Harlan Delf was a man who had never believed anyone would dare. That Tobias had brought the sack home and had put it in the chest with a full accounting written in his own hand, and had welded the chest shut, and had intended to bring the whole matter to the state auditor when the auditor came. But that Harlan Delf had died of a heart attack on the 3rd of November, 12 days before the bank failed publicly. And that with Delf dead, there was no man alive who could corroborate a word Tobias said, and any accusation from him would sound like the desperate lie of a thief trying to shift the blame. And so Tobias had sat on the chest, and had let the town believe what it was going to believe, and had lived under it for the 2 years he had left, and had asked his wife to never open the chest and to never sell it, and Ada Merriweather had kept that promise for 17 years. The portfolio was the accounting. Names, dates, serial numbers on the coins. A signed affidavit witnessed by no one because there had been no one to witness it. The cotton pouch was the gold. 143 double eagles, 1908 through 1932, and a rough tally at the bottom of the ledger, putting the face value at $2,860, and the collector's value at something Tobias had not lived long enough to guess at, and which by April of 1978 was closer to $40,000 than to anything else. Elias Coker sat in his shop with the letter in his hand, and the pouch on the bench, and the whippoorwill still going outside, and he thought about it for a long time. He could have kept the gold. He could have burned the letter in the stove that stood in the corner of the shop, and no man alive would have known the difference. The Merriweathers were gone. The bank was gone. Harlan Delph was gone. Delbert Hoyle would have gone on calling it the Coker coffin until the day he died, and Elias would have gone on being the fool who paid $40 for a boat anchor and $40,000 in gold, would have sat under the floor of his shop for the rest of his life and gone to a niece in Kansas City when he died. He thought about it, and I will not tell you he did not, because a story that pretends a man is not tempted is not a true story. He thought about it for perhaps 4 minutes. And then he folded the letter back into its envelope and put the envelope in his shirt pocket and closed the lid of the chest and turned out the light and went to bed. The next morning he drove into Rolla and found the daughter. Her name was Nell Merriweather Bishop, and she was 51 years old and worked as a bookkeeper at a hospital and had 2 grown sons, and had not spoken her father's name in public in 19 years because of what people said when she did. Elias found her at her kitchen table on a Saturday morning in a housecoat with her hair still in curlers, and he took off his cap and he stood in her doorway and he said, "Mrs. Bishop, my name is Elias Coker, and I bought your daddy's trunk at the auction." And he laid the letter and the portfolio and the pouch on her kitchen table, and he told her, in as few words as he could, what was in each. And when she began to cry, he looked at the floor, and when she tried to thank him, he said, "No, ma'am, I don't need any of that." And he put his cap back on, and he went out to his truck and drove home before she could get herself together enough to follow him to the door. The state auditor's office reopened the file in June. The county newspaper ran the story in July under a headline 3 inches high. The gold was returned to the surviving depositors, or to their heirs, at 10 cents on the dollar of its current value, which was more than any of them had ever expected to see. Nell Merriweather Bishop stood on the courthouse steps in August and read a short statement that ended with her father's name, and she did not cry when she read it, though a good many other people did. Delbert Hoyle said very little that summer. He stopped taking the back booth at the Bluebird. His salesman noticed that he had gone quiet in a way that did not suit him, and one of them told his wife that Delbert had aged 5 years in a season. The dealership on Route 9 went under in the fall of 1981 for reasons that had nothing directly to do with the chest, and everything to do with the kind of man Delbert Hoyle turned out to be when things stopped being easy. And by the spring of 1982 he had sold the house on the square, and Sable Creek did not hear from him again. The chest itself went to the County Historical Society, which cleaned it and set it on a low platform inside a glass case in the front room of the old Carnegie Library on Elm Street. A brass plaque beside the case tells the story in about 200 words and ends with the sentence, "The name of Tobias J. Merriweather is restored." Elias Coker went to see it once, on a Tuesday evening in October of 1978, after the library had closed, but before the caretaker had locked the door. He stood across the room from the case with his cap in his hands, and he looked at the chest for perhaps 2 minutes, and he did not go closer, and he did not read the plaque because he already knew what it said. Then he put his cap back on, and he walked out to his truck, and he drove home along the creek in the last of the light, and he opened the shop, and he swept the floor, and he put his tools away, because there was a Yale deadbolt from the Baptist parsonage waiting on the bench that he had promised to have ready by Thursday. And Elias Coker had never in his life gone back on a promise about a lock. So I'll leave it with you. If you had been the one in that shop alone, with a letter no one else in the world had read, and a pouch of gold no one alive knew existed, and a whole town that had already made up its mind you were a fool, would you have carried it into Rolla on a Saturday morning and laid it on a stranger's kitchen table and walked away before she could thank you? Or would you have closed the lid and turned out the light and let the dead stay buried under the story the living had told about them?